Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaur Bhaktivinoda Ki Jai. I offer my respectful obeisances unto the lotus feet of my spiritual masters. The worst thing that a devotee can do is to offend another devotee. Immediately fall out of good grace, And by finding fault with a devotee, that eventually spreads to finding fault with the spiritual master. And that is not a good place to be, to find fault with the spiritual master. And it starts with finding fault with the devotees. It's not an easy one. And it's something that pretty much everyone has to deal with, one degree or another. So, just don't like somebody. And they're right there where you are, and you just don't like them. The sound of their voice, things they say, everything just irritates and distracts and forget Krishna. And then you start to obsess on this distraction. You become entrapped by it. You forget Krishna. And that spreads to the spiritual master. Start to find fault with the spiritual master also. And then that person's position is without that connection with the representative of the Lord. And just cut loose and floating around until he can make another connection at some point, either with that person, that spiritual master, or Krishna sends somebody else at some point. So, it's not an easy one, but it is a big one for devotional life. I'm very, very stubborn about these things. It's a bad habit, actually. It's just a bad habit to find fault with somebody. Very bad habit. So, we'll work on it. It's not going to be overnight. It's a gradual process of cutting back. To be able to identify it, you're well on your way to uprooting it. So the identification is going on, the process. I'm identifying the problem. Problem is distraction. allowing myself to be distracted and to focus on something or someone other than Krishna. Now, if you have a spiritual master, you have to be able to put your full faith in that person, that they are your connection with God. You have to be able to put full faith there. If you can't put full faith there, move on. So it's a little bit of a test right now, whether I can put full faith in this spiritual master, or if I've gone as far as I can go with this person, and maybe there's someone else that I can put full faith in. So, it's a good one. For now, let me just read from the Bhagavatam. Glories to Srila Prabhupada. Continuation of the fourth canto, chapter 28, text 31. Purāṇa becomes a woman in the next life. Om Namo Bhagavate Vyāsadevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vyāsadevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vyāsadevaya. My dear King Prachinabhahisat, the sons of Malayadvaja gave birth to many thousands and thousands of sons, and all of these have been protecting the entire world up to the end of one Manu's lifespan and even afterward. So this is the continuation of the allegorical story of the fictional king Purāṇa, who represented the position of anyone. He was like, could be anyone, the jiva, and his attachments to the material, family, extension of the body, family, country, city, wealth. And then old age, he was attacked by old age and death. And he was taken away by the agents of Yamaraj, and it was decided what his next body would be. Because he was so attached to his wife, which symbolizes his intelligence, he took birth as a woman in this next life. And Vidarbhi, princess actually. This is still allegory. This is not historical. It's just an illustrative story that Narada Muni is relating to King Prachinabharisat to help him look at his own position in an objective way, so that the king, Purāṇa was illustrating the position of King Prachinabharisat. So you give him some objective view. And so Vidarbhi was married to a devotee, King Malayadvaja, and talking about their offspring now. From this union came the 7 processes of devotional service as practiced under rules and regulations. Mark. They were the 7 sons. And there was one daughter. Who was the daughter? All right. Talks about the 7 sons. Who was the one daughter? Oh. Daughter says that she was a devotee. She always had her eyes fixed on the form of Krishna. Okay. So, the verse again, text 31. My dear King Prachinavarasat, the sons of Maya Vajra gave birth to many thousands and thousands of sons. And all of these have been protecting the entire world up to the end of one Manu's lifespan and afterward. This is an interesting little section here in the purport. Prabhupada says, among Vaishnavas, there may be some difference of opinion due to everyone's personal identity. But despite all personal differences, the cult of Krishna consciousness must go on. We can see that under the instructions of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj began preaching the Krishna consciousness movement in an organized way within the past 100 years. The disciples of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj are all God brothers, and although there are some differences of opinion, and although we are not acting conjointly, every one of us is spreading this Krishna consciousness movement according to his own capacity and producing many disciples to spread it all over the world. The cult of Krishna consciousness based on the 9 principles of devotional service, Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Smaranam, Padasevanam, Archanam, Vandanam, Dasyam, Sakyam, Atmanivedanam, will never be stopped. It will go on without distinction of caste, creed, colony, or country. No one can check it. The word bokshate is very important in this verse. Just as a king gives protection to his citizens, these devotees, following the principles of devotional service, will give protection to all the people of the world. The people of the world are very much harassed by so-called religious principles, swamis, yogis, karmis, and jnanis, but none of these can show the right way to become elevated to the spiritual platform. There are primarily 4 parties spreading devotional service all over the universe. These are the Ramanuja Sampradaya, Madhva Sampradaya, Vishnu Swami Sampradaya, and Nimbarka Sampradaya. The Madhva Gaudiya Sampradaya in particular comes from Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. All these devotees are spreading the Krishna consciousness movement very widely and giving protection to innocent people who are being so much harassed by pseudo-avatars, swamis, yogis, and others. 32. The great sage named Agastya married the firstborn daughter of Malayadvaja, the avowed devotee of Lord Krishna. From her, one son was born, whose name was Dhritachyuta, and from him another son was born, whose name was Idmavaha. The name Agastya Muni is very significant. Agastya Muni represents the mind. The word Agastya indicates that the senses do not act independently, and the word Muni means mind. Mind is the center of all the senses. Thus, the senses cannot work independent of the mind. When the mind takes to the cult of bhakti, it engages in devotional service. The cult of bhakti, Bhakti Lata, is the first daughter of Malayadvaja, and as previously described, her eyes are always upon Krishna. One cannot render bhakti to any demigod. Bhakti can be rendered only to Vishnu. Thinking the absolute truth to be without form, the Mayavadis say that the word bhakti can apply to any form of worship. If this were the case, a devotee could imagine any demigod or any godly form and worship it. This, however, is not the real fact. The real fact is that bhakti can be applied only to Lord Vishnu and his expansions. Therefore, Bhakti Lata is Dhritavrata, the great vow. For when the mind is completely engaged in devotional service, the mind does not fall down. If one tries to advance by other means, karma yoga, jnana yoga, one will fall down. But if one is fixed in bhakti, he never falls down. Thus, from Bhakti Lata, the son Dhritachyuta is born, and from Dhritachyuta, the next son, Idmavaha, is born. The word Idmavaha refers to one who carries wood for burning in a sacrifice when approaching a spiritual master. The point is that Bhakti Lata, the cult of devotion, fixes one in his spiritual position. One so fixed never comes down, and he begets children who are strict followers of Shastric injunctions. After this, the great saint King Malayadvaja divided his entire kingdom among his sons. Then, in order to worship Lord Krishna with full attention, he went to a solitary place known as Kulachala. Malayadvaja, the great king, was certainly a Mahabhagavat topmost devotee. By executing devotional service, he begot many sons and disciples for propagating the bhakti cult. Shravanam Kirtanam Vishnu. Actually, the entire world should be divided among such disciples. Everyone should be engaged in preaching the cult of Krishna consciousness. In other words, when disciples are grown up and are able to preach, the spiritual master should retire, sit down in a solitary place to write and execute nirjana bhajana. This means sitting silently in a solitary place and executing devotional service. This nirjana bhajana, which is the silent worship of the Supreme Lord, is not possible for a neophyte devotee. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur never advised a neophyte to go to a solitary place to engage in devotional service. Indeed, he has written a song in this connection. My dear mind, What kind of devotee are you? Simply for cheap adoration, you sit in a solitary place and pretend to chant the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. This is all cheating. Thus, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur advocated that every devotee, under the guidance of an expert spiritual master, preach the bhakti cult. Only when one is mature can he sit in a solitary place and retire from preaching all over the world. Following this example, the devotees now render service as preachers in various parts of the world. Just as the moonshine follows the moon at night, immediately after King Malayadvaja departed for Kulachala, his devoted wife, whose eyes were very enchanting, followed him, giving up all homely happiness despite family and children. The word Madhirakshana is also significant in this verse. Srila Jiva Goswami has explained in his Sandarbha that the word Madhira means intoxicating. If one's eyes become intoxicated upon seeing the deity, he may be called Madhirakshana. Queen Vidarbhi's eyes were very enchanting, just as one's eyes are Madhirakshana when engaged in seeing the temple deity. Unless one is an advanced devotee, he cannot fix his eyes on the deity in the temple. In the province of Kulachala, there were rivers named Trandavasa, Tamraparni, Vatodaka. King Malayadvaja used to go to those pious rivers regularly and take his bath there. Thus he purified himself externally and internally. He took his bath and ate bulbs, seeds, leaves, flowers, roots, fruits, and grasses, and drank water. In this way he underwent severe austerities. Eventually he became very skinny. Through austerity, King Malayadvaja in body and mind gradually became equal to the dualities of cold and heat, happiness and distress, wind and rain, hunger and thirst, the pleasant and the unpleasant. In this way he conquered all relativities. Thus, in order to transcend dualities, one must always engage in the service of the Lord. As confirmed in Bhagavad Gita, Mam chayo vyabhicharena bhakti yogena sevate sagunan samatityaitan brahmabhuyaya kalpate. One who engages in full devotional service, who does not fall down in any circumstance, but once transcends the modes of material nature, comes to the level of Brahman. If one is factually engaged in the service of the Lord, Bhakti Yoga, he will automatically control his senses, his tongue, and so many other things. Once engaged in the Bhakti Yoga process with all sincerity, one will have no chance of falling down. Even if one falls down, there's no loss. One's devotional activities may be stunned or choked for the time being, but as soon as there is another chance, the practitioner begins from the point where he left off. By worshipping, executing austerities, and following regulative principles, King Malayadvaja conquered his senses, his life, and his consciousness. Thus, he fixed everything on the central point of the Supreme Brahman, Krishna. Yeah, that word Brahman. Purport. Whenever the word Brahman appears, the impersonalists take this to mean the impersonal effulgence, Brahmajyoti. Actually, however, Para Brahman, the Supreme Brahman, is Krishna, Vasudeva. As stated in Bhagavad Gita, Vasudeva Sarvamiti. Vasudeva extends everywhere as the impersonal Brahman. One cannot fix one's mind upon an impersonal something. Bhagavad Gita therefore says, for those whose minds are attached to the unmanifested, impersonal feature of the Supreme, advancement is very troublesome. Consequently, when it is said herein that King Malayadvaja fixed his mind on Brahman, Brahman means Supreme Personality of Godhead, Vasudeva. In this way, he stayed immovable in one place for 100 years by the calculation of the demigods. After this time, he developed pure devotional attraction for Krishna, Supreme Personality of Godhead, and remained fixed in that position. King Malayadvaja attained perfect knowledge by being able to distinguish the supersoul from the individual soul. The individual soul is localized, whereas the supersoul is all-pervasive. He became perfect in knowledge that the material body is not the soul, but that the soul is the witness of the material body. In this way, King Malayadvaja attained perfect knowledge because in his pure state he was directly instructed by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. By means of such enlightening transcendental knowledge, he could understand everything from all angles of vision. In this verse, the words Sakshat Bhagavata, are very significant. The Supreme Personality of Godhead speaks directly to the individual soul when the devotee has completely purified himself by rendering devotional service to the Lord. Lord Krishna confirms this also in Bhagavad Gita. Tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam priti purvakam tatami buddhi yogam tam yena mamupayanti te. To those who are constantly devoted and worship me with love, give the understanding by which they can come to me. The Lord is the super soul seated in everyone's heart, and he acts as the Chaitya Guru, spiritual master within. However, he gives direct instructions only to the advanced pure devotees. In the beginning, when a devotee is serious and sincere, the Lord gives him directions from within to approach a bona fide spiritual master. When one is trained by the spiritual master according to the regulative principles of devotional service and is situated on the platform of spontaneous attachment for the Lord, Raga Bhakti, the Lord also gives instructions from within. Tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam priti purvakam. This distinct advantage is obtained by a liberated soul. Having attained this stage, King Malayadvaja was directly in touch with the Supreme Lord and receiving instructions from him directly. King Malayadvaja could thus observe that the super soul was sitting by his side, and that he, as the individual soul, was sitting by the side of the Supersoul. Since both were together, there was no need for separate interest. Thus he ceased from such activities. In the advanced stage of devotional service, the devotee does not see anything separate between his own interests and those of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Both interests become one, for the devotee does not act for a separate interest. What he does in the interest of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. At that time, he sees everything in the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the Supreme Personality of Godhead in everything. Having attained this stage of understanding, he sees no distinction between the spiritual and material worlds. In perfect vision, the material world becomes the spiritual world due to its being the external energy of the Supreme Lord. For the perfect devotee, the energy and the energetic are non-different. Thus, the so-called material world becomes spiritual. Sarvam kalo idam brahma. Everything is intended for the service of the Supreme Lord, and the expert devotee can utilize any so-called material thing for the Lord's service. We cannot serve the Lord without being situated on the spiritual platform. Thus, if a so-called material thing is dovetailed in the service of the Lord, it is no longer to be considered material. Thus, the pure devotee, in his perfect vision, sees from all angles. The daughter of King Vidarbha accepted her husband all in all as the Supreme. She gave up all sensual enjoyment and in complete renunciation followed the principles of her husband, who was so advanced. Thus she remained engaged in his service. Figuratively, King Malayavaja is the spiritual master, and his wife, Vidarbhi, is the disciple. The disciple accepts the spiritual master as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. As stated by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur in Guruvastika, Sakshad Daritvena. One directly accepts the Guru, spiritual master, as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. One should accept the spiritual master, not in the sense that the Mayavadi philosophers do, but in the way recommended here. The spiritual master is the most confidential servant of the Lord. He should be treated exactly like the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The spiritual master should never be neglected or disobeyed like an ordinary person. If a woman is fortunate enough to be the wife of a pure devotee, she can serve her husband without any desire for sense gratification. If she remains engaged in the service of her exalted husband, she will automatically attain the spiritual perfections of her husband. If a disciple gets a bona fide spiritual master, simply by satisfying him, he can attain a similar opportunity to serve the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The daughter of King Vidarbha wore old garments, and she was lean and thin because of her vows of austerity. Since she did not arrange her hair, it became entangled and twisted in locks. Although she remained always near her husband, she was as silent and unagitated as the flame of an undisturbed fire. When one begins to burn firewood, there is smoke and agitation in the beginning. Although there are so many disturbances in the beginning, once the fire is completely set, the firewood burns steadily. Similarly, when both husband and wife follow regulative principles of austerity, they remain silent and are not agitated by sex impulses. At such a time, both husband and wife are benefited spiritually. One can attain this stage of life by completely giving up a luxurious mode of life. The daughter of King Vidarbha continued as usual to serve her husband, who was seated in a steady posture until she could ascertain that he had passed away from the body. It appears that the queen did not even talk to her husband while serving. She would simply perform her prescribed duties without talk. Thus, she did not stop rendering service until she could ascertain that her husband had passed from the body. While she was serving her husband by massaging his legs, she could feel that his feet were no longer warm and could thus understand that he had already passed from the body. She felt great anxiety upon being left alone. Bereft of her husband's company, she felt exactly as the deer feels when being separated from its mate. Being now alone and a widow in that forest, the daughter of Vidarbha began to lament, incessantly shedding tears which soaked her breast and crying very loudly. Figurative, the queen is supposed to be the disciple of the king. Thus, when the mortal body of the spiritual master expires, his disciples should cry exactly as the queen cries when the king leaves his body. However, the disciple and the spiritual master are never separated, because the spiritual master always keeps company with the disciple as long as the disciple follows strictly the instructions of the spiritual master. This is called the association of Vani, words. Physical presence is called Vapu. As long as the spiritual master is physically present, the disciple should serve the physical body of the spiritual master. And when the spiritual master is no longer physically present, the disciple should serve the instructions of the spiritual master. O best of the kings, please get up. Get up. Just see this world surrounded by water and infested with rogues and so-called kings. This world is very much afraid, and it is your duty to protect her. Whenever an acharya comes, following the superior orders of the Supreme Personality of Godhead or his representative, he establishes the principles of religion as enunciated in Bhagavad Gita. Religion means abiding by the orders of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Religious principles begin from the time one surrenders to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It is the Acharya's duty to spread a bona fide religious system and induce everyone to bow down before the Supreme Lord. One executes the religious principles by rendering devotional service, specifically 9 items like hearing, chanting, remembering. Unfortunately, when the Acharya disappears, rogues and non-devotees take advantage and immediately begin to introduce unauthorized principles in the name of so-called swamis, yogis, philanthropists, welfare workers, and so on. Actually, human life is meant for executing the orders of the Supreme Lord, and this is stated in Bhagavad Gita. Manmana bhava mad bhakto madhyachimam namaskuru mame vaishyasi yutvaivam atmanam mat parayana. Engage your mind always in thinking of me. Become my devotee, offer obeisances, and worship me. Being completely absorbed in me, surely you will come to me. The main business of human society is to think of the Supreme Personality of Godhead at all times, and to become his devotees, to worship the Supreme Lord, to bow down before him. The Acharya, the authorized representative of the Supreme Lord, establishes these principles, but when he disappears, things once again become disordered. The perfect disciples of the Acharya try to relieve the situation by sincerely following the instructions of the spiritual master. At the present moment, practically the entire world is afraid of rogues and non-devotees Therefore, this Krishna consciousness movement is started to save the world from irreligious principles. Everyone should cooperate with this movement in order to bring about actual peace and happiness in the world. That most obedient wife thus fell down at the feet of her dead husband, began to cry pitifully in that solitary forest. Thus the tears rolled down from her eyes. Just as a devoted wife becomes afflicted at the passing away of her husband, when a spiritual master passes away, the disciple becomes similarly bereaved. She then prepared a blazing fire with firewood and placed the dead body of her husband upon it. When this was finished, she lamented severely and prepared herself to perish in the fire with her husband. This indicates that a devotee's wife must be prepared to act in such a way. Similarly, a devoted disciple of the spiritual master would rather die with the spiritual master than fail to execute the spiritual master's mission. As the Supreme Personality of Godhead comes down upon this earth to reestablish the principles of religion, so his representative, the spiritual master, also comes to reestablish religious principles. It is the duty of the disciples to take charge of the mission of the spiritual master and execute it properly. Otherwise, the disciple should decide to die along with the spiritual master. In other words, to execute the will of the spiritual master, the disciple should be prepared to lay down his life and abandon all personal considerations. My dear king, one Brahmin, who was an old friend of King Purāṇa, came to that place and began to pacify the queen with sweet words. My dear king, one Brahmin, who was an old friend of King Purāṇa, came to that place and began to pacify the queen with words. The appearance of an old friend in the form of a Brahmin is very significant. In his Paramatma feature, Krishna is the old friend of everyone. According to Vedic injunction, Krishna is sitting with the living entity side by side. According to Shruti mantra, the Lord is sitting within the heart of every living entity as Sharit, the best friend. The Lord is always eager to have the living entity come home, back to Godhead. Sitting with the living entity as witness, the Lord gives him all chances to enjoy himself materially. But whenever there is an opportunity, the Lord gives good counsel and advises the living entity to abandon trying to become happy through material adjustment and instead turn his face toward the Supreme Personality of Godhead and surrender unto him. When one becomes serious to follow the mission of the spiritual master, his resolution is tantamount to seeing the Supreme Personality of Godhead. As explained before, this means meeting the Supreme Personality of Godhead in the instruction of the spiritual master. This is technically called Vani Seva. The disciple must stick to whatever the spiritual master orders. Simply by following on that line, one sees the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Supreme Personality of Godhead Paramatma appeared before the queen as a Brahmin, but why didn't he appear in his original form as Sri Krishna? Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur remarks that unless one is very highly elevated in loving the Supreme Personality of Godhead, one cannot see him as he is, Nonetheless, if one sticks to the principles enunciated by the spiritual master, somehow or other he is in association with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Since the Lord is in the heart, he can advise a sincere disciple from within. This is also confirmed in Bhagavad Gita. Tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam priti purvakam dadami buddhi yogam tam yenamam upayantite. To those who are constantly devoted and worship me with love, I give the understanding by which they can come to me. If a disciple is very serious to execute the mission of the spiritual master, he immediately associates with the Supreme Personality of Godhead by Vani or Vapu. This is the only secret of success in seeing the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Instead of being eager to see the Lord in some bush of Vrindavan, while at the same time engaging in sense gratification, if one instead sticks to the principle of following the words of the spiritual master, he will see the Supreme Lord without difficulty. Srila Bilva Mangal Thakur has therefore said, "If I am engaged in devotional service unto you, my dear Lord, then very easily can I perceive your presence everywhere. And as far as liberation is concerned, I think that liberation stands at my door with folded hands, waiting to serve me, and all material conveniences, dharma, artha, kama, and moksha, dharma, artha, kama, stand with her. If one is very highly advanced in devotional service, he will have no difficulty in seeing the Supreme Personality of Godhead. If one engages in the service of the spiritual master, he not only sees the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but he attains liberation. As far as material conveniences are concerned, they automatically come, just as the maidservants of a queen follow the queen wherever she goes. Liberation is no problem for the pure devotee, and all material conveniences are simply awaiting him at all stages of life." So, that's the reading for now. Nice section. Very nice. Jai Srila Prabhupada.